Tokyo Bay. Late summer, 1944. A humid silence drifts through the narrow hallways of the Naval Technical Research Institute. Ceiling fans hum weakly over a table lit by a single yellow lamp. On it rests a small metal box, dented, scorched, and bearing the unmistakable American insignia. A captured U.S. Army Signal Corps radio receiver. 3 Japanese engineers lean in. Their uniforms are rumpled, their eyes ringed with exhaustion. The war has turned against them. Fuel is scarce, resources thin. Yet the enemy's technology continues to evolve. Chief Engineer Masaru Ibuka, a quiet man who once designed civilian radios, adjusts his glasses and begins to unscrew the casing. Inside, an intricate maze of copper wires, crystal components, and a design philosophy unlike anything they had built. He whispers only one word to the man beside him: miraculous. The air feels heavy, not with fear, but with realization. For the first time, Japan's engineers see the technological gulf that separates them from their enemy. By 1944, Japan's empire was fighting for survival across the Pacific. The skies, once dominated by the rising sun, now thundered with the engines of American B-29 superfortresses. Supply routes had been severed, industrial output strangled, and the promise of victory that glimmered in 1941 had long since faded into smoke. Yet, deep within Tokyo's secret laboratories, another war raged. One fought not with bullets or bombs, but with frequencies, circuits, and signals. The unseen battlefield of radio intelligence. From the beginning of the Pacific War, communication technology had shaped every strategic outcome. The Americans mastered rapid coordination through compact, mass-produced field radios. On land, at sea, and in the air, their forces operated as one synchronized machine, a moving orchestra of precision. For Japan, whose industry relied on craftsmanship more than mass production, such uniformity was difficult to achieve. Radios were heavier, less reliable, and often incompatible between Army, Navy, and air units. In early 1944, as U.S. Marines advanced through the Marshall Islands, Japanese signal units began intercepting strange, consistent transmissions, clear, crisp, and remarkably stable despite the chaotic Pacific weather. Engineers at the Naval Technical Research Institute in Tokyo were ordered to analyze them. They noted something unprecedented. The enemy's signals barely drifted in frequency, even after hours of operation. This was impossible by Japanese standards, where most field radios suffered from interference, fading, or component overheating. Weeks later, near Saipan, a damaged American bomber was recovered. Among the wreckage lay a small intact radio receiver. It was immediately sent back to Tokyo under the highest secrecy. This was no ordinary trophy. It was a revelation in metal form. Inside the institute, engineers quickly identified its origin, an SCR-274N, part of the American Airborne Communication Suite used across the Pacific. It was a marvel of modular engineering, built with precision capacitors, miniature vacuum tubes, and a stability system based on quartz-controlled oscillators. The Japanese engineers, accustomed to hand-tuned circuits and variable coils, were astonished by its consistency and resilience. One of them reportedly remarked, "Even if you drop it, it will still hold frequency." The discovery triggered an internal awakening. Japan's technical officers realized that America's advantage was not just in production numbers or raw resources, it was in system design philosophy. Every component of the American war machine was built for interchangeability and reliability under chaos. At that time, Japanese electronics relied heavily on small workshops, manual calibration, and local suppliers. Vacuum tubes, for instance, were fragile and inconsistent. Their performance varied from batch to batch, making long-distance radio stability nearly impossible. Meanwhile, American factories like RCA and Western Electric were producing standardized components in the millions, identical, rugged, and interchangeable. The engineers in Tokyo understood what this meant. Japan's radio infrastructure could not compete with the industrial rhythm of the United States. Even if they copied this captured device, they could never mass produce it at scale. But they could learn from it and adapt what they could. As Masaru Ibuka and his colleagues continued dismantling the radio, they filled notebooks with detailed sketches, comparing American circuitry with Japanese equivalents. They were struck by how the design emphasized practicality over elegance, a principle that mirrored America's broader approach to the war. Outside the laboratory walls, air raid sirens wailed almost nightly. Bombers approached Tokyo from distant Pacific islands, guided by their flawless radio systems. And while civilians ran for shelter, Japan's best engineers stayed in their rooms of light and static, chasing the invisible advantage of the enemy. In those quiet moments between air raid alerts, they began to realize something deeper. The war of machines was no longer fought on battlefields. It was fought in the silence of laboratories and the hum of circuits. They captured. American radio sparked a wave of technical introspection within Japan's military-industrial establishment. At the center of this effort was the Naval Technical Research Institute, NTRI, in Meguro, Tokyo, an unassuming complex of concrete buildings filled with the quiet whine of testing equipment and the smell of solder. It was here that Japan's most brilliant electrical minds worked, often in isolation, seeking to bridge a technological chasm that seemed to widen with every Allied advance. For years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had prided itself on ingenuity and discipline. Its early radio engineers had developed sophisticated long-range transmitters and direction-finding systems for warships during the 1930s. But by the mid-1940s, Japan's capacity to innovate under pressure had been throttled by blockade, resource shortages, and fragmented military command structures. The Army and Navy maintained separate research facilities, often refusing to share discoveries with each other. In contrast, the United States operated under a far more integrated wartime system. Civilian scientists, corporate engineers, and the military worked as a unified network. The difference in philosophy was staggering. American research teams, often stationed at universities like MIT and Harvard, were backed by vast industrial suppliers capable of translating prototypes into mass production within weeks. Meanwhile, in Japan, many critical components were still handmade in small workshops. The result was inconsistency, a flaw that rippled across every branch of the armed forces. The captured SCR-274N was a case study in how American efficiency translated into battlefield dominance. The radio's modular construction allowed for easy replacement in the field. Frontline mechanics could swap out broken parts in minutes. For the Japanese, such simplicity felt revolutionary. Their equipment, though skillfully crafted, demanded specialized technicians even for minor repairs. As engineers dissected the radio, they uncovered a level of precision previously unseen in Japanese communications technology. The quartz crystal oscillator was the most astonishing feature. American radios maintained perfect frequency stability thanks to these crystals, which vibrated at fixed rates unaffected by heat or vibration. Japanese radios, by contrast, often relied on manually tuned coils that drifted under field conditions. Engineers at NTRI began experimenting with locally available quartz. But production was limited, and precision cutting required industrial tools Japan did not possess. Even the chemical purity of American components exceeded their expectations. The copper wiring was oxygen-free, the resistors finely calibrated, and the solder joints remarkably uniform, evidence of factory-controlled quality. This discovery led to an uncomfortable truth. Japan's war industry had reached the limits of artisanal craftsmanship. No matter how skilled the individual worker, without large-scale standardization and supply consistency, even brilliance could not sustain modern war. Still, Japan's scientists refused to give up. They began redesigning existing naval radios using insights gained from the captured model. Some innovations found their way into late-war projects like the Type 99 Mark II Model 3 shipborne communication system, which attempted to mimic American circuit stability. Yet the improvements came too late, arriving just as Allied submarines cut vital supply lines and air raids crippled production. Amid the growing despair of 1944 and 1945, engineers in Tokyo continued their studies in near darkness. Blackout curtains drawn, windows taped to withstand bomb blasts. They worked by candlelight when electricity failed, sketching by hand, experimenting with salvaged parts. Reports from these sessions show a haunting dedication. Calculations written beside burned vacuum tubes, circuit diagrams annotated with ash marks, evidence of raids interrupting their work. Outside the city, American bombers dominated the sky. The same type of radios Japan had studied now coordinated vast aerial formations, guiding aircraft hundreds of miles from their bases with pinpoint precision. Japanese civilians heard their low, steady drone and looked upward, the sound of a war no longer within reach. The engineers understood this better than anyone. For all their skill, they were now spectators to a technological symphony orchestrated by an enemy whose communication network had become invincible. Each B-29, each aircraft carrier, each submarine, all spoke to one another through the invisible airwaves that Japan could no longer command. And so, deep within the labs of Tokyo, the quiet realization took root. The war for air superiority had been lost long before the cities burned. It had been lost in the circuits long before the first bomb fell. To the Japanese engineers who examined that American radio, technology was no longer an abstract concept. It was the tangible embodiment of defeat. The war had exposed a truth hidden beneath years of pride and nationalism. Industrial science had become the deciding weapon of the modern battlefield. The SCR-274N they dissected represented the new philosophy of warfare, precision through standardization. Unlike Japanese communication equipment, which emphasized mechanical artistry, the American system prioritized functionality and scalability. Components were interchangeable, circuitry modular, and every screw placement identical across thousands of units. For the Americans, this was no miracle. It was the result of an industrial ecosystem designed for efficiency. Companies like RCA, Western Electric, and Collins Radio Company had streamlined designs that could be mass-produced without sacrificing quality. Even their vacuum tubes were pre-tested to ensure exact tolerance levels, an idea nearly alien to the Japanese approach of hand-fitted calibration. Japanese scientists were awestruck by the use of crystal-controlled oscillators. In their own equipment, frequencies were adjusted manually, leading to drift, interference, and loss of clarity over distance. But the Americans had replaced instability with scientific precision. The quartz crystals, cut, cleaned, and mounted within hermetically sealed cases, guaranteed unwavering frequency stability, unaffected by tropical humidity or aircraft vibration. This single innovation transformed Allied coordination. It allowed pilots, naval officers, and ground commanders to share exact positions in real time. And in war, accuracy meant life or death. For Japan, replicating such precision was impossible. The machinery for cutting and calibrating quartz was sophisticated and required materials and tools unavailable under wartime embargo. Japan's electronics industry could analyze the concept but not reproduce it at scale. To the engineers who held that captured radio in their hands, it was as if they were touching the future, a future already owned by their enemy. Inside the Naval Technical Research Institute, the atmosphere was quiet but heavy with realization. These were not soldiers. They were craftsmen of science, men who once built radios for peacetime homes, now turned into instruments of survival. Among them was Masaru Ibuka, who would one day co-found Sony. During the war, he was a senior engineer tasked with designing improved communication systems for the Imperial Navy. He was meticulous, patient, and deeply curious. Yet even he felt the growing frustration of working within a system defined by secrecy and inefficiency. His notebooks from 1944 reflected both admiration and despair. He wrote that the American design showed a kind of simplicity that hides great thought. It wasn't that the Americans were smarter, it was that they were freer. Collaboration between engineers, scientists, and industry had created an open exchange of ideas. In Japan, knowledge was compartmentalized, guarded, and often duplicated wastefully across military divisions. The human toll was immense. Many of these engineers worked endless nights under air raid alarms, surviving on little food and less sleep. Yet, in their exhaustion, they were still driven by a strange kind of admiration. They saw in their enemies' craftsmanship a mirror of their own lost potential, what Japan could have been, had it embraced collaboration and modern manufacturing long before the war. Ibuka's post-war reflections would later reveal how deeply this moment shaped him. The captured radio was not just a technical object. It was a revelation of philosophy. It taught him that true progress came not from isolation, but from shared effort, an idea that would become central to Japan's technological rebirth in the decades ahead. While scientists studied the circuitry, Japan's military leadership began to grasp the operational implications. Communication was not a support function, it was a strategic weapon. The Americans had mastered radio discipline. Every platoon, every aircraft, every naval squadron operated under unified frequency control. Their cryptographic systems, aided by advanced transmitters, allowed secure coordination over vast distances. The Japanese, on the other hand, often relied on predetermined signals or hand-delivered messages when radio clarity failed. During major engagements like the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, this gap proved devastating. American pilots received coordinated instructions mid-air, while Japanese units struggled to adapt once battle began. Their radios, often unstable under high-altitude conditions, introduced fatal seconds of delay. Those seconds determined who lived and who didn't. The captured radio thus became more than an engineering curiosity. It symbolized how Japan's communication weaknesses had silently shaped its battlefield losses. Each technological shortfall multiplied through command chains, leaving entire divisions vulnerable to chaos. For Japan's high command, this realization came too late. They had underestimated not only the might of America's factories, but also the intelligence of its systems. Radios like the SCR-274N were not simply devices. They were the connective tissue of a vast military organism that could see, hear, and react faster than any enemy. The Japanese engineers could only study and record, hoping their findings might one day close the gap. But by the time their reports reached command desks, the sky above Tokyo already trembled with the hum of B-29 engines, guided, coordinated, and invincible through the very technology now sitting dismantled on their tables. In the silence of their laboratories, the engineers faced a strange moral conflict. They were patriots, serving their nation with loyalty, yet what they discovered filled them with reluctant admiration for their adversary. They could not help but respect the logic, discipline, and intelligence that had gone into that radio's design. It was, in many ways, a masterpiece of democratic engineering, a product of open innovation and trust in science. And here lay the paradox. Japan's own scientific talent was immense, yet it was restrained by hierarchy and secrecy. The engineers had the minds to create wonders, but not the freedom to implement them. Each wire they examined was a reminder of how the war had misdirected Japan's genius, and from building progress to building destruction. The captured American radio was more than a weapon. It was a quiet teacher. Japan entered World War II with courage, discipline, and faith in its artisans, but not with the industrial infrastructure needed for a prolonged technological war. The captured American radio exposed this divide more clearly than any battlefield statistic ever could. The American war machine functioned as a single synchronized system. Scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and the military all linked through standardized design philosophies. Every component, whether a vacuum tube or a screw, adhered to precise national specifications. If a radio failed in the Solomon Islands, its part could be replaced by another built in Chicago or New York, with absolute compatibility. Japan's industry, though skilled, was fragmented. Each factory used its own tooling standards. Components varied by region, sometimes even by batch. This inconsistency crippled Japan's ability to mass-produce precision electronics. Even when engineers perfectly understood the design of the captured SCR-274N, they could not replicate its uniformity. Reports from the Naval Technical Research Institute, NTRI, described the engineers' astonishment at the modular design. The American radio was built like a puzzle of removable units, each serving a specific function: transmitter, receiver, frequency control, power supply, all interchangeable. If one failed, a soldier could replace it in the field within minutes, without specialized knowledge. Japanese field equipment, by contrast, required skilled technicians for repairs. Radios had to be tuned manually after every component swap, a slow, delicate process impossible amid battle. This difference between field-ready and workshop-only machinery mirrored the broader gap in industrial philosophy. The Americans built for practicality, the Japanese for precision. And yet, that very precision, the obsession with detail and beauty of design, would become the seed of Japan's post-war renaissance. What the engineers learned from their defeat was that craftsmanship and mass production were not enemies, but partners waiting to be united. Within the narrow halls of the NTRI, under blackout curtains and flickering bulbs, realization came not as shock, but as silence. The captured American radio symbolized more than technological superiority. It revealed an entire worldview. The Americans approached machines as tools to empower ordinary soldiers, devices designed for simplicity and durability, not complexity. The Japanese approach still echoed the artisan spirit, that mastery came through skill, not accessibility. To the engineers, this realization was deeply personal. Their culture prized discipline and perfection, but the war had shown that perfection without adaptability was weakness. They began to understand that the true strength of technology lay not in its brilliance, but in its ability to serve many, not few. The study of the captured radio became a moment of philosophical awakening, a glimpse of what Japan could become if it learned from its enemy instead of merely resisting him. Some engineers even referred to the radio as a teacher. They admired how it united science and practicality, reflecting a democratic principle that power should be distributed, not hoarded. Years later, when peace returned, those same engineers carried this lesson into Japan's rebuilding. Masaru Ibuka, Akio Morita, and others who survived the war would apply what they had learned in those dark laboratories to civilian technology: radios, tape recorders, televisions. The ghosts of that American circuit would live on in every transistor and every portable Radio Japan exported to the world. The silence of realization had become the sound of transformation. For Japan's wartime engineers, studying an enemy's radio was a task of necessity, but emotionally, it was an act of humility. Pride had once defined their mission. They believed in the superiority of Japanese craftsmanship, the divine guidance of the emperor, the unbreakable will of the nation. But when they opened that metal casing and saw perfection in simplicity, pride turned into something else: respect. Engineers described their experience in words more fitting of reflection than research. They marveled at the clean logic of the design. They noted how even the smallest parts were clearly labeled and standardized. One report read, "It seems the American mind builds not for one man, but for all men." Such acknowledgement was rare and courageous. Admitting the enemy's superiority in any domain during wartime bordered on disloyalty. Yet these men were loyal in a deeper sense. to truth, to learning, and to their craft. Psychologically, this moment marked the beginning of a quiet internal revolution within Japan's scientific community. They realized that defeat, though bitter, could be the greatest teacher. And from that humility came curiosity, and from curiosity, rebirth. The Japanese study of captured American technology was not limited to this single radio. Throughout the late stages of the war, engineers examined downed aircraft, radar components, and naval electronics, seeking insights they could apply. But the radio stood out because it was deeply personal, a voice machine, a symbol of communication itself. In the years that followed, this act of study would define Japan's post-war identity. Imitation was not seen as shameful, but as the first step toward understanding. And understanding led to innovation. The engineers who once worked in dark laboratories became the architects of Japan's technological renaissance. They built radios, tape decks, and recorders that combined American practicality with Japanese precision. The very design philosophy they once admired in secret became their own, refined, perfected, and exported back to the world. The B-29s that had once filled Japanese skies with terror would, a decade later, be replaced by the hum of Japanese radios filling American homes with music. And so, in studying a single captured machine, Japan's engineers had unknowingly begun writing the blueprint of their nation's rebirth. As the war's final year unfolded, the lessons learned in that laboratory would echo far beyond Tokyo, into factories, universities, and eventually, living rooms around the world. The same minds that had once studied destruction would soon turn to creation. By mid-1944, Japan's engineers no longer needed laboratories to witness American superiority. The proof filled the skies. Over the Pacific, across the jungles of Burma, and above the burning oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the Americans spoke through their machines. Every B-29, every carrier-borne Avenger, every fleet radio operator, all connected through a vast web of communication that Japan could neither intercept nor silence. What had begun years earlier in that dimly lit laboratory, the study of a single captured radio, had become a living nightmare for Japanese commanders. They now faced an enemy whose coordination seemed almost supernatural. Bombing runs executed with clockwork precision. Naval strikes synchronized across hundreds of miles. Even lone fighter patrols could call reinforcements instantly, as though guided by a shared, invisible mind. The secret was not magic. It was communication. The B-29 raids. When coordination became a weapon in June 1944, the first waves of B-29 superfortresses appeared over Japan's outer islands. They were enormous, shining beasts of aluminum and power, faster, higher, and deadlier than anything Japan could counter. But what struck Japanese observers wasn't just their strength, it was their orchestration. Radar operators in Tokyo reported that the bombers arrived as if following an unseen line. Anti-aircraft. Gunners were baffled by how the formations adjusted mid-flight, maintaining tight spacing even through thick cloud cover. In truth, the B-29 crews were guided by a communication system decades ahead of anything Japan possessed. Using the ARC-5 radio suite, a spiritual successor to the captured SCR-274N, the Americans achieved near real-time coordination between bombers, navigators, and control centers thousands of kilometers away. Japanese attempts to jam these frequencies failed repeatedly. The radios operated across variable bands, switching channels to avoid interference. To the defenders below, it seemed as though the bombers were guided by instinct, but in reality, they were guided by precision engineering and disciplined communication. When American planes turned mid-mission, Japanese analysts often assumed new tactics or codes. What they were actually witnessing was the effect of reliable long-range command. Orders could be given in flight, formation changes executed instantly, targets redirected without confusion. The war of iron and fire had become a war of information. Inside the Naval General Staff headquarters in Tokyo, engineers and officers gathered in stunned silence as reports arrived from across the Pacific. Task forces moving flawlessly across vast oceans, carrier groups striking with minute-to-minute precision, fighters rerouting mid-battle to defend allies dozens of miles away. They realized something devastating. Japan was no longer fighting a single enemy fleet. It was fighting a connected system, one that thought, moved, and reacted as a single entity. The captured radio on the laboratory table had once seemed like an isolated marvel, but now they saw it for what it truly was, a piece of an enormous, perfectly integrated machine. A senior communication officer reportedly remarked, "Their power does not lie in the gun, but in the signal." This statement was both an admission and an awakening. By late 1944, Japan's technical division scrambled to catch up. Engineers who had once studied the American radio now attempted to replicate its design for use in their own aircraft. But shortages of copper, vacuum tubes, and precision tools crippled production. They could build prototypes, brilliant in concept, but not the thousands required for the war effort. The industrial network simply could not sustain such scale. One NTRI engineer wrote in a private note later discovered after the war, "We have understood the future, but we cannot build it in time." It was a haunting truth. Japan's intellectual awakening had come too late. Even as they learned from their enemy, factories burned, cities crumbled, and supply chains collapsed under relentless bombardment. Then came the night of March 9-10. 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo. More than 300 B-29s descended over the city in a carefully timed operation. Each wave communicated flawlessly with the next. Flight leaders coordinated drop sequences in real time, adjusting for wind and cloud cover through constant radio chatter. Below, Japanese operators tried desperately to respond, but their network was in chaos. Radios overloaded, frequencies jammed, and communication lines cut. The irony was unbearable. The very technology they had admired in secret was now orchestrating the destruction of their capital. Amid the flames, many of the engineers who had once studied the captured radio stood helpless, watching the living embodiment of its power tear their world apart. They understood, perhaps more clearly than any general, that this was not merely defeat, it was transformation through fire. For in that night of destruction lay the final lesson. Technology, when unified by purpose and precision, could reshape not just war, but the future of nations. As dawn broke over a city of smoke and silence, Japan's engineers faced a choice: remain bound to the past, or rebuild from the ashes with the knowledge they had gained from the enemy they once sought to overcome. By the summer of 1945, the sound of American radios filled the Pacific airwaves like an unstoppable tide. Every island, every ship, every aircraft carrier, the Americans spoke in perfect coordination. Meanwhile, Japan's once ambitious communication network was fragmenting. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy operated on entirely separate radio systems, each guarded by its own encryption standards and frequency allocations. What had once been considered secrecy was now isolation. Messages often took hours to relay. Orders were lost between command posts. Units fought without knowing where their allies were. And while American forces adapted in real time, Japan's commanders waited for confirmations that never came. In Saipan, defenders waited for air support that had already been destroyed. In Okinawa, ground units received conflicting orders because their frequencies overlapped. And over Kyushu, radar operators picked up American transmissions with crystal clarity, while their own pilots could barely hear headquarters through static and distortion. The war of technology was ending exactly as it had begun. Not with a roar, but with the hum of a radio. At the Naval Technical Research Institute, the once bustling laboratory that had dissected the captured American radio now sat in quiet disarray. Papers scattered, shelves bare, engineers weary. Masaru Ibuka, the same man who had opened that radio casing in 1944, now stood before a pile of broken transmitters, their circuits charred from overuse. Around him, his remaining colleagues stared at signal maps marked with American call signs. Everywhere they turned, the enemy's presence was inescapable. American aircraft used high-frequency single-sideband SSB communication, clearer, longer-reaching, and far less susceptible to interference. Japanese models still relied heavily on amplitude modulation, AM systems, that distorted under static. Even when Japan captured new Allied radios, the technical gap was so immense that full replication was impossible without Western-grade manufacturing tools. It was no longer about who could build more, it was about who could build smarter, and by 1945, America had proven that mastery of information, not merely of weapons, would decide the fate of the modern battlefield. In a desperate effort to unify what remained, Japan's engineers initiated Project Kikusui, an attempt to centralize military communication through a high-frequency coordination channel linking air, sea, and ground. But when the first tests were conducted in August 1945, interference crippled the system. Static drowned out commands, transmitters overheated, and the prototype relay collapsed within minutes. Then came a chilling broadcast, a clear, confident American voice echoing over the same frequency. The message wasn't taunting. It was operational, a bomber command issuing altitude adjustments. The Japanese technicians fell silent. Their own signal had been swallowed by the superior clarity of the American transmission. That moment, that final overlap, symbolized the irreversible shift of power. The air itself now belonged to the enemy. Days later, on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice broke through the static across Japan. For many citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard him. The radio broadcast, fragile, interrupted, yet unmistakable, announced the nation's surrender. It was poetic in a grim way. Japan, whose engineers had once sought to master the power of transmission, now used that same medium to accept defeat. The device that had begun this story, a captured American radio, had revealed a truth far greater than its circuitry. The future of warfare, and indeed of civilization, would be decided not by firepower, but by connection. In the weeks that followed, Allied engineers entered Tokyo to inspect the remnants of Japan's research facilities. Among the ruins of the NTRI and the Army Communications Arsenal, they found sketches, incomplete prototypes, and technical notes referencing high-clarity signal design based on U.S. Model 274N. Masaru Ibuka, along with his colleague Akio Morita, quietly took those lessons forward into peace. Within a few short years, they would form a small company known as Sony Corporation. Its mission, to perfect communication, not for war but for life. The irony could not have been greater, that from the ashes of technological defeat, Japan would rise to become one of the world's greatest leaders in communication technology. The war had ended, but the lesson endured. Clarity, precision, and the invisible power of connection were now the true weapons of the modern world. On an abandoned airstrip outside Yokosuka, a single Japanese technician remained after the surrender. He powered on a damaged American radio, the same model that had begun their research. Through the soft crackle of static, he heard distant chatter, American pilots coordinating a landing. Their voices were calm, professional, human. He smiled faintly. For the first time, he understood not just the technology, but the spirit behind it, discipline, cooperation, trust. He reached forward and turned the dial one last time, letting the signal fade into silence. That silence was not defeat, it was transition, from war to understanding, from destruction to creation, from isolation to connection. And it all began with one radio that crossed the ocean. September 1945. Japan lay silent. Cities burned to ash. Factories collapsed, and the hum of machines was replaced by the groan of hunger and despair. The once mighty empire that had chased technological dominance now stood amid the ruins of its own ambition. But in that silence, something unusual began to stir. Not military recovery, not defiance, but curiosity. Within the shattered laboratories of Tokyo's Naval Technical Research Institute, engineers sifted through fragments of circuitry, salvaging resistors, transistors, and vacuum tubes from whatever remained. To most soldiers, they were scraps. To these men, they were the raw pieces of a new beginning. The radio that had once been an object of military study was now a symbol of a larger revelation. Japan's defeat had not been solely on the battlefield. But in the invisible war of innovation, the message was clear. In the age to come, mastery of technology would no longer serve destruction alone. It would rebuild nations. Under General Douglas MacArthur's occupation reforms, Japan's industries were disarmed, but not dismantled. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, recognized that Japan's scientific potential could serve peace. Many engineers who had once developed military radios were reassigned to civilian projects under Allied supervision. The Americans didn't just bring democracy, they brought exposure. They introduced Western education models, scientific journals, and industrial transparency, principles alien to the closed hierarchy of wartime Japan. Japanese engineers, previously isolated from global developments, suddenly found themselves studying the world's best designs firsthand. Everything from American radar units to RCA broadcast systems, and while the military structure had collapsed, the minds behind it had not. Masaru Ibuka, who had studied the American radio with disbelief just a year before, now worked to repurpose that knowledge. Together with physicist Akio Morita, he envisioned a company that would take the lessons of wartime electronics and translate them into everyday life. It would begin with one product, a simple tape recorder. But symbolically, it was much more, a tool that transformed captured military technology into a peaceful voice for education, music, and communication. As Japan's cities rebuilt, the American occupation broadcast daily updates over radio networks. These transmissions, once a source of dread, became the soundtrack of post-war recovery. Civilians gathered around radios not to fear invasion, but to hear news of ration programs, repatriation, and reconstruction. For the Japanese people, the radio had changed meaning. It was no longer an enemy's voice. It was a link to the outside world, a medium of truth, not propaganda, a symbol of connection, not control. And as engineers refined their skills, a cultural transformation followed. Technical schools flourished. Youth joined repair shops and electrical institutes, hungry to master what had once seemed unreachable. By 1950, Japan's communication technology industry had reborn itself from the ground up. The foundations laid by wartime innovation, vacuum tube design, frequency control, and signal precision now powered a generation of consumer products. The radio, once dissected under dim lights and wartime secrecy, became a beacon of peace on every Japanese shelf. What began as imitation evolved rapidly into innovation. Japan didn't just copy American devices, it improved them. By the late 1950s, Japanese companies produced some of the smallest, most efficient transistor radios in the world. These radios, exported globally, redefined the image of Japanese craftsmanship. Precise, reliable, and forward-thinking. The same engineers who once studied the American military radio now competed with American corporations in open markets. The irony was unmistakable. The defeat that had humbled Japan became the very catalyst for its rebirth, and while much of the world saw the Pacific War as an end, for Japan's engineers, it had been the most brutal classroom in history. Every resistor, every solder joint, every transmission learned in hardship became the foundation of an empire reborn, not of conquest, but of creation. By the dawn of the 1950s, Japan had transformed itself from a defeated empire into a laboratory of innovation. The wreckage of military industry gave birth to an entirely new economic identity: manufacturing for peace. In small Tokyo workshops, engineers who once wired radio detonators now soldered components for home receivers. The sound that once guided bombers across the Pacific now carried voices, songs, and baseball games. The United States, recognizing Japan's potential as a technological ally against the Soviet bloc, invested heavily in industrial revival. Through initiatives like the Dodge Plan and U.S. procurement programs during the Korean War, Japanese factories retooled to produce communication equipment, cables, and precision instruments for American forces. This collaboration ignited something profound: the fusion of Japanese discipline and American science. Factories that had once built military radios for the Imperial Navy now assembled transmitters for the United Nations Command in Korea. The tools of war had become instruments of cooperation. One understood the power of listening better than Japan. In the aftermath of destruction, the Japanese people didn't shout to the world, they listened. They listened to Western engineers explaining transistor theory. They listened to American scientists describing circuit miniaturization, and they listened to their own memories, the static, the signals, the hum of those captured American radios, and vowed to do it better. This quiet determination turned Japan into a hub of post-war technological excellence. By the mid-1950s, companies like Sony, Toshiba, and Matsushita Panasonic emerged from obscurity. Their mission wasn't national pride, it was precision, quality, and clarity. Sony's TR-63 transistor radio, released in 1957, symbolized this transformation. It was light, portable, beautifully engineered, and it worked everywhere. For the first time, the world didn't just hear Japan, it listened to Japan. The engineers who once stood in dim, anxious laboratories during the war now saw their creations displayed in shop windows across New York, London, and Paris. What began as defeat had become dialogue. During the early years of the Cold War, communication became humanity's most powerful weapon. And Japan, once a student of American signal mastery, was now a key partner in it. American intelligence agencies collaborated with Japanese companies to build advanced radio, surveillance, and early warning systems across the Pacific. Japanese precision manufacturing became indispensable to Western electronics. This time, the flow of knowledge was two-way. American firms supplied research grants. Japanese engineers supplied innovation. Together, they built a global communication web, from transoceanic cables to the first generation of satellite receivers. In less than a decade, Japan went from decoding enemy signals to helping power the very networks that connected the post-war world. The post-war Japanese engineer lived by a simple creed born from the ashes of defeat. Nothing wasted. Everything learned. Scarcity forced creativity. Lack of materials led to smaller, more efficient circuits. Limited access to Western patents encouraged experimentation, and humility, born of loss, inspired perfectionism. What emerged was a culture of relentless improvement. Kaizen, every production line, every design meeting, every radio tuned across the nation reflected this quiet philosophy. The lessons from 1944, from that captured American radio, had evolved into something far greater. A belief that technology was not a secret to guard, but a language to share. Japan no longer feared the hum of the American frequency. It had created its own. By the 1960s, Japan's economic miracle was in full motion. Radios gave way to televisions. Televisions evolved into cameras, tape decks, and eventually computers. Yet, in the heart of many older engineers as men who had once studied that captured radio under the flickering lamp, the memory remained vivid. They remembered the awe they felt hearing that first crystal clear American signal, they remembered realizing how far behind they were, and they remembered the silent vow made that night to close that gap, not with war, but with wisdom. That promise reshaped a nation, and through that nation, it reshaped the modern world. The war ended long ago. The fires are gone. The skies are quiet, and the echoes of marching boots have faded into history. But the hum of one small radio, that faint American signal heard through static in 1944, still reverberates through time. For Japan's engineers, it was more than a device. It was a mirror. Inside its circuits lay the reflection of a truth they had long ignored. That mastery of machines was not merely a matter of strength or secrecy, but of openness, precision, and shared knowledge. That single captured radio changed the way Japan saw technology forever. It transformed defeat into direction, and curiosity into culture. It became the silent teacher that guided a nation from ruin to renaissance. From the ashes of war rose a country that chose to listen rather than shout, to learn rather than defy. In the decades that followed, the world came to recognize Japan not as the empire that once sought domination, but as a builder of tools of trust, of connection. The hum that once announced the enemy's power became the heartbeat of peace. Every transistor, every satellite, every signal that crossed the Pacific carried a quiet echo of that night in 1944, when three engineers leaned over a captured radio and realized that the true power of a nation lay not in its weapons, but in its understanding. The world they helped shape is ours now. One linked not by conquest, but by communication. And somewhere beneath the endless static of history, that same frequency still whispers a timeless truth. Knowledge is not conquered. It is shared.